Well, good morning, everyone. I am very, very pleased to be here, and I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on, and to pay my respects to their elders past and present. I spend a little bit of time talking about appropriate protocols of welcome, because as what my role is basically chairing the Federation of Ethnic Communities Councils of Australia, so I'm the #1 ethnic in Australia, in case you wanted a brand. I think it's really incumbent on us to recognise that as migrants we do need to both respect and acknowledge the First Peoples of this country, and I don't think we do it nearly enough. And I think it's interesting, my languages are English, Italian, a little dialect called Grumese, and I think probably the most important one in my role, government. I speak government. I'm pleased and honoured to be here today presenting this is my second MyLanguage Conference, and I speak at a lot of conferences, but this one particularly challenges me because what you deal with is challenging. It's not about going out and telling people what everyone knows needs to be done. It's about challenging thinking. It's about considering difference. And they're unique in the cultural diversity space, and they do challenge our thinking. They excite us with the possibilities and force us to address basic questions around community life, information, communication, knowledge, and ultimately, I think what's probably more important, all of the thematics, if we're in a multicultural society, what does it mean for belonging and participation for us? I'll frame my presentation today in discussing the issue of language in Australia, and it'll be predominantly political. I know that's going to surprise a lot of you, but that's what I do. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to give it quite a specific frame. I'm going to talk about positioning called languages and called community data in our public spaces. I'm going to look at questions around political will to consider linguistic diversity and actively provide for it through policy, resources and practice. I was here yesterday afternoon and I saw some of the economics around digitising and cost, and at the end of the day it does come down to dollars. What we can do does come down to dollars. It also comes down to creativity and energy, but you know, with all the great will in the world, it still needs to be paid for. Of course, any advocacy in our current, I believe, rationalist environment needs to be based on a strong evidence base. It is only when the weight of numbers is brought to bear that we are able to get any attention to our issues and our agendas, and I know this really well because it's so easy to marginalise diversity in Australia. I'm interested in the speech that we heard last night about how good Australia is, because in a way I don't want to be a glass half empty person, but I believe we're actually at the bottom of the glass at the moment. We've got a long way to go to fill that glass. But in terms of Australian diversity, if there's any doubt that we're diverse, certainly, what was it? The last week of June, we had the long-awaited census figures, and they are really, really interesting. We're blessed in Australia because we can actually describe ourselves in some of the most precise terms, and with the tools to be able to understand who is where and what their language is and when they came to Australia and what their ancestry is and where they're engaged, how they're employed, on and on and on and on. And the beauty of that is it allows us to be able to articulate in any area of our operations what is the non-English component and what does it actually mean. Well, 2011 tells us that we are diverse. 27% of all the people here are born overseas, and at least 20% have one parent born overseas. 47% of this migration represents the second period in migration, I believe, in which those born overseas almost outnumber those who were born here. And you'd have to go back to the 1800s and the gold rushes when that was here again. Those speaking a language other than English has increased 24% since 2006, and we number now 3,912,934, but we're not really precise, are we? Mandarin is now the largest non-English language spoken in Australia, increasing 52% to 336,000 people, and there are 410 on top of that as well. So what we're looking at is an overall population of 22 million, close to 336,000 speak Mandarin. If I add Cantonese, Chiu-Chow, and a number of the other Chinese dialects, I'm actually looking at more than 500,000 people. 500,000 people are ethnic Chinese speakers here. Oh, in fact, I'm low. The total number speaking one of the Chinese languages is 650,000 in Australia. In the area of religion, Catholics grew by 6%, Anglicans fell 1%, Hindus grew 86%, Islam grew 40%, and no religion grew by 30%. In the past decade, Christian affiliation decreased from 68 to 61. And the most common non-English groups were not the Muslims, but the Buddhists. Yes, Islam was there at 2.2% and Hinduism at 1.3% of the population. And Hinduism grew most over the past 10 years. And I can go on and on and on with figures. The statistics are eye-opening, but they need to be drilled into to deliver both meaning and relevance. When considering the themes of this conference and the My Language initiative, and I think at various points I've called it an initiative, a collaboration, a project, but you know what I mean, My Language, it is clear that the headline data item that we should be looking at in all of that is 3,912,934 people in 2011 who spoke a language other than English at home. 1 year on now, and we are in August 2012, it would be safe for me to claim 400,000 people, 4 million as a number of us speaking a language other than English. 4 million people. This is not marginal. It's no longer marginal, 4 million people. But what does this actually mean in both public and private life? What are the initiatives, information systems and myriad of cultural activities which sustain the life of these languages in Australia and their use in everything from supporting early settlement through to supporting community life and to feeding and enhancing cultural capital that is non-Anglo-Celtic? Where is this range of linguistic life seen and recorded, which is clearly an issue for this conference? And finally, what does it mean for government policy settings and its national agendas? These are all big questions, which I certainly will not be answering today, yet there is both value and opportunity to consider them and to understand why things are as they are, and to explain the differences we experience in getting both attention and resources to this area of language and cultural products. I want to position called languages and community data in our... I want to talk about the public space, because I think what will happen is that all of us have experiences, but when we actually look around us, and that's important, we look around us, what are we actually seeing? What is the public space manifestation of this diversity? Given the above data, a reasonable assumption would be that multilingual and culturally diverse product would be clogging up our cultural institutions, our museums, our galleries, our libraries, our cinemas and playhouses, and our town hall and our streets. 4 million, there should be heaps and heaps of product out there. And perhaps maybe in considering this, I should turn the question to you and ask you to list 5 occurrences in the past year in which you noted our civic and cultural spaces not only containing but celebrating diverse product. And I think it's interesting because I actually applied it to myself. I asked myself in writing this, I said, okay, you answer it, Pino. Well, when I put it to myself, I found it really easy. I found it really easy because my frame was very narrow. I live almost, or I work, but I spend a lot of hours there, in Norton Street in Leichhardt. And it's a few doors down from the Palace Cinema, which hosts regular film festivals such as the Italian, French, Spanish and Greek film festivals. I'm also constantly in the multicultural space. So I could also add that the City Sydney Council Lunar New Year celebrations is really prominent. And then I started to almost flounder. I got through the film and I got through the Chinese New Year. And I started to find it really hard to come up with more. I did recall a flyer for an African performance night that came across my desk and some great stuff coming out of the Casula Powerhouse in the southwest of Sydney over the past few months. And I'm also on the mailing list of Multicultural Arts Victoria, so I know about the great stuff they're doing. But at that point, I gave up with a nagging doubt as to whether the question was fair, you know. And if I was to make a point of all this, in a conference speech, no less, should I have undertaken a more detailed research, reference my approach and spend far more time in collecting the information? Should I have actually given you a sense of the cultural product that exists? But I shook myself out of that doubt because it would have been too much work. Given that if I had to resort to research methodology other than my own awareness, I would not be replicating the common experience, the day-to-day experience, and that's what I was trying to actually touch. Given my assessment, and given the situation, that there really is, and I think this was my conclusion, a scarcity of events, performances, exhibitions that were in other languages or delivering diverse cultural product. And while I was able to cite the various film festivals, I also realised and I think this is a true thing, is that that's not Australian. They are film festivals showing us what's being produced overseas in languages that we speak, but it's not our product. So my conclusion is that even in someone who's living in this space, there is precious little space and place in our public domain in which diverse product exists and is able to be accessed by a wider community. I mentioned the Casula Powerhouse as an exception, and would also mention the Victorian Multicultural, my Immigration Museum, the MyLanguage Collaboration, the Multicultural Arts Victoria, and I'm really pleased to acknowledge the work that BMAC are doing up here. It's really wonderful in terms of what's being done. And these are examples of what can be achieved when will and resources exist, even small level resources. But it is important to note that I have not suggested that a possible cause of this scarcity is lack of actual product. As given my public and professional life, I'm surrounded by that product, and I'm contradicting myself, because one is an issue of what I see and the other one is an issue of the groups that I actually deal with, and then what I know that those groups are actually doing. Once we move beyond the monochrome public space, what we do find is an extraordinary amount of activity, of material, of information and cultural product development in the life of individual communities. There is, and you'd know this to be true, a continuing and historic non-English press which has served immigrating communities for the past 70 years. Currently, there are over 150 press titles in over 40 languages. And you wouldn't know that. You wouldn't know that in Sydney, in every day, I can pick up 4 Chinese language dailies, 25 titles over the week. It's extraordinary given the fact that Sydney sustains only 2 other dailies in that city. Broadcast media has also evolved from those early days of 2EA and 3A and the late night Italian radio program on 2SM and the eponymous variety Italian style. I don't know if anyone is an Italian background, but I grew up where the first inkling of language on TV was a program on Channel 9. It was weekly and it was a lifestyle program and was hosted by Anne Luciano. And that was our start. And I remember vividly having to wait up at 11 o'clock with my family just to hear Italian on the TV. And what we now have is a current broadcast media spearheaded by SBS and extended through community radio, free-to-air channels, narrowcast and subscription channels. And one of the growing realities in Australia is that many called Australians are accessing the majority of their information from overseas sources, and that today in houses, right now in houses all over Australia, people will be viewing Italian, Greek, Arabic, Portuguese, Mandarin, Spanish TVs, which are beamed in 24 hours a day and received through either subscription or individual satellite dish. There are all these lives being led. It's all in other languages. But the big question is how much of it is actually local, how much of it is Australian, and what does that actually mean for us as ongoing citizens of this place in this time? There's also a growing online presence and use of digital platforms that have been fed by wave after wave of new immigrants coming to Australia, with levels of digital literacy greater than the local population. There is, of course, a great differential in our communities in this regard. My presentation to the last MyLanguage Conference considered 3, what I believe, really important access considerations to that online space. The first one is, to use it, you actually had to have literacy in your own language, let alone English. Also, you need a digital literacy. And I think for many communities as well, especially those newly arrived, you need a digital access. The thing comes at a cost, and all of those things applied. And this is an area I'll return to in this presentation. But where digital literacy exists, the preferred source of information are again overseas sites, overseas newspapers, and even country-specific social media. In the Chinese community in Australia, they aren't Facebook, they certainly are in some numbers, but Weibo is their social media of choice. And it's a huge media in China. So what we're seeing is, yes, a lot of expression of diversity and media use, but we're not seeing it in the public spaces, and a lot of it is coming from overseas. In fact, the majority of it. There's also a plethora of community-specific information in the form of meeting minutes, annual reports, community information pieces and publications, bill posters and promotional material, seminars and workshops, literally all the artefacts of dynamic community lives which exist in our suburbs, places of worship, the media outlets and the online space. But they're there, but they're not in our public spaces. There's also a photographic record which exists, but will be lost over time. In my history with FECCA and the SECs, I was privileged to know and work with a Polish refugee woman, an advocate named Nina Skoroszewska. With camera in tow, she photographed meetings, conference personalities in the first 20 years of that whole movement. These boxes of photographs that she took were recently acquired by us, and my hope is that we'll be able to give them life. But when I look at that, I look at all these images and there's no one who knows who those people were. And I think, why have we got to this stage? Why have we not really taken it upon ourselves to record our own histories? And this was brought very much into relief last month because I spent an extraordinary afternoon at Ellis Island in New York, and anyone who gets the opportunity has got to do it. It is amazing. What an amazing collection of photos, the exhibitions. And what affected me most was the visual record. Photo after photo, I stood in front, enticing me to feel what they felt, to see what they saw, and to aspire to what they were aspiring to. We do not have that in Australia. I reflected on where our visual record is here. I know of the great work being done by the two Italian historical societies in Sydney and Melbourne, and the collections of Effie Alexakis and historian Leonard Janevsky on the Greek community, but overall the amount of visual product in our formal records is limited. My contention in this argument is that while we have maintained the language of multiculturalism, our practices have indeed thwarted the valuing and recording of community data, the minimising its presence in public and civil spaces, and we just have not done enough. For me, the reason for this is our collective lack of comfort, and it stands in, again, contrast to what's been discussed today. I contend to you that we are not comfortable with languages other than English, and there is a clear lack of political will to change this. With regard to the former statement, I want to reference a situation a few years ago which I think really does give it life, the point I'm trying to make. And it was in the Marrickville local government area in which the council attempted to introduce an ordinance prohibiting the use of loat shop signs unless an English version was also used. So Marrickville Council was saying, unless you're going to put the English, you are no longer allowed to say on your shop hoarding what you do in your language. The issue was centred around a video shop which rented out and sold Vietnamese and Chinese language videos. The debate was a very interesting one, which was played out in the local media as well as a really big run on the ABC local channel 2BL. The line being run was how unfair it was to people who cannot speak those languages or read them not to know what was being sold in that shop. It was an issue of fairness and access. It was about public rights, and the whole lingua franca thing came out, and more than anything else, how uncomfortable it feels to be left out, excluded, and in that case, on the margin of that shop. The broadcaster on 2BL was a Victorian by growing up and a New South Wales person by career move, Virginia Trioli. She'd moved to Sydney from Melbourne and was doing the morning program on the local ABC. And she was equally outraged, and she argued, why should she not be able to know what the shop sold? The fact that the shop would only be relevant to her if she did indeed speak Vietnamese, Mandarin or Cantonese escaped her. What wrangled was the lack of capacity to know, and what wrangled was being left out. Okay, we've got a mainstream which does feel really uncomfortable when things happen that they're not party to. In my response, and my poor wife had to calm me down, I railed against the radio saying, well, welcome to my world, because my father, who struggled with the English world and not only felt uncomfortable and felt absolutely no comfort into it in that unless it was a purely Italian paradigm, because that's where he felt comfort. Then I can calm down. I did calm down. And I thought how ironic it was in the type of work that I was doing. We do remain as a whole a community that is uncomfortable when people in our earshot are speaking in a language not ours. A community that doesn't really understand why they didn't learn English, and a community which sees efforts to accommodate other languages and spend precious resources, both as political correctness gone mad and a huge waste of money. That is my world. That is what I deal with every day, the questioning of validity in this field every single day. Intrinsically, it is a debate about not only our national identity, but also what forms being Australian can take. Can you be Australian if you don't speak English? Can you be Australian if your main source of information is from overseas? Can you be Australian if you don't know, and this is a classic, Don Bradman's batting average? Again, the word irony and the added concept of self-fulfilling prophecy comes to mind, because the more we do not cater for people's language needs across the information and media spectrum, the more we will push them to other non-Australian platforms and sources. It is self-fulfilling. You do not provide, people will find other avenues. It is for this reason that FECCA has been unequivocal in its support for SBS and its expansion, and the wonderful work done by the NBC and all those other, tireless editors who go out, and they're two-bit operations, but they go out and they produce information. And I saw yesterday afternoon some of those very early newspapers, and they are still there, and they're very, very large numbers, and the role they play is certainly unidentified and not lauded and not praised, but it's absolutely essential. But the question is, and the one I will turn to now, is political will. What does language mean in the current environment in which debates on national identity are feared and any threat or challenge to English language is met with strong resistance? Whether it's still a legacy of the Howard years or indeed the precarious position of the current federal government, there is a strong evidence that political will in this area is weak. In a permanent and temporary migration program which operates in the millions, our whole political discourse and the headlines in our newspapers focus on 4,000 to 6,000 irregular boat arrivals each year. We appear to be more concerned about the rights of Andrew Bolt over those of the individuals he has been shown to have vilified, and he has been shown to have vilified in a court of law under Australian law. We are happy to produce some multilingual material so that we can tick our compliance boxes, but we do not test their quality. We look for the cheapest provider, and then we place them so deep in our government sites that you need superior digital and English literacy even to find them. And most important of all, you need a printer to be able to print them out. We have stopped producing multilingual material because it's all online, and it's going to come at a cost. And we have recoiled from the M word for many years. The newfound fondness for its use and the use of multicultural and multiculturalism by the federal government now is interesting, but it has been non-existing in the past 15, 16 years. I did a study where I tried to look at all of John Howard's speeches. He mentioned the word twice in 12 years. It was a considered, strategic, philosophical opposition to diversity, and I think we are still suffering the results of that. And it is now changing. I find it really interesting that it's now changing, and the government is starting to come back to both the use of the word and looking at some of the programs. But it didn't come because they saw it as being the right thing. It came because organisations like my own, FECCA, and the individual ECCs and a whole lot of people in our community were basically saying enough and there's enough. We cannot maximise the value of our diverse population until we recognise that they are diverse and that they have rights and that they have needs. The question then remains as to how we can get away with publicly lauding our diversity but doing little to nurture it and make it truly part of our national identity. In researching this paper, I was keen to anchor my current thinking to others who have been involved in promoting a broader language policy in Australia. It's through this process that I came across a couple of paragraphs written by Joseph LaBianco, who's been referenced a few times at this conference in 2003, which I think provide the answer. You know what it's like when you actually work in a field for years and years and years and you read something and think, oh God, I wish I'd written that. And that's what he wrote. He wrote, "The governing theoretical ideal of thoughtful multicultural discourse has been a separation of the domains of the political from the cultural nation. By this logic, the political nation remains a vertical structure, a unitary, English-speaking, representative parliamentary democracy governed by law, based in notions of formal, legal and economic equality, and buttressed by a single common citizenship. On the other hand, the cultural nation is characterised by horizontal affinities of culture, language, plural identity, attachments and notions of community." A wonderful articulation of what our reality is. We speak diversity, but we require unity in everything we do. This rings so true, but also requires the consideration of, if this is the case, then why do we then have a range of funding going to ethnic communities? Why is there such broad community life? And I've lost my thought on the train, and I think it's interesting that what he actually says, and it's again something that I've actually responded to when people have said, why is your multiculturalism in Australia held up so much more than, say, multiculturalism in Europe? And I said, well, one, they're different beasts, and two, there is a major difference in Australia, and Joe actually wrote about it. Relatively liberal citizenship laws combined with compulsory voting produced a large urban constituency that the political classes appealed to with cultural politics in which languages featured prominently. That was the answer. The answer was that you could come to Australia and become a citizen within 2 years. On top of that, you lived in areas of other people who were like you, because that's what settlement is. You go to places which cater for your food needs, cater for your social needs, your religious needs. And in Australia, we have electoral politics. We don't all vote for a president. We vote for our local member. And as soon as you put people with voting rights in areas where they have critical mass, you have political power. And I think it's interesting, if we're to understand where we are in multiculturalism, we need to understand that the whole philosophy is about unitary movement, but the political reality is we still need to give out, bits and pieces of money and attention to ethnic communities, because they actually can make a difference to whether we get voted or not. So in effect, because ethnic communities have political power through their citizenship and settlement areas, they have been courted and supported, but only to the extent that this support does not challenge the vertical political line. Yet at the same time, what could be seen as non-visible barriers exist to stop and limit the impact of this diversity. I think this is a conundrum, and indeed it's notable and does explain our constant position on the margin and our continuing struggle for legitimacy and space within the array of specific interests. I've made this huge outcry around the new aged care reform program, and I know that sounds a bit weird talking in my language about reform, but it was a real kind of like from the heart. How can you not consider the needs of called ageing when they represent 1 in 3 of the 65 plus population? And the response from the Department of Health and Ageing was, but if we do it for your group, we're going to have to do it for everyone. And I go, yes, yes, of course, because that is what society is. It is not one group of people. It's a series of segments. It's a series of need groups. And anything which is actually done for the whole population needs the internal flexibility to meet the needs of those specific groups. But while I've been critical of the government generally, I do want to, and I'm not being paid for this, but I do want to spend some time on the political leadership shown by Senator Kate Lundy in her previous role as Parliamentary Secretary and her current role as Minister for Multicultural Affairs, because she is making a difference. Senator Lundy has identified and supported a range of key initiatives which deserve to be noted. She has championed a new multicultural policy which was adopted by a government about 18 months ago. She's developing, and has caused to be developed, a national anti-racism strategy through the Australian Human Rights Commission. She's enhanced the role of the Australian Multicultural Council. She's promoting a broader and more effective settlement framework and strategy to maximise the settlement experiences of all migrants. And finally, she's commissioned a review of the access and equity programs of the federal government with a report which was launched at the end of July. With each of these initiatives, there's been a regaining of lost territory and a growing legitimacy. And in this context, I would call on you as professionals with an interest in this area to use these growing opportunities to stake a larger claim for linguistic and cultural diversity. You know what? We've become so used to being fed little that we actually aren't asking for more. We need to demand more, because it's only in demanding more that we actually are going to achieve any form of structural change over the long term. I'd like to spend just a few moments on the last of these, the Access and Equity Review. I was part of the review panel, and overall there was a feeling that the access and equity considerations, and that's a jargon we use, those who aren't in that field, which is about the capacity of our structures to deal with diversity across the service set and across the policy development set. So overall there was a feeling that the access and equity considerations in federal government agencies had waned, and that the notion of a framework to be interpreted by departments which demonstrated a lack of interest, was problematic. Basically, they didn't care. Now, I won't mention names, in interviews with key departmental heads, and I say, well, how are you dealing with multilingual considerations in your public information provision? And one of them, quotable quote, on our website, we've got 3 online translation tools. Did you hear that? 3 online translation tools. For a government which actually bends over backwards to make sure that every word is perfect and how it communicates with the population, could you imagine putting up a piece of information and you're requiring an online translation tool to deliver the message? It is unacceptable. It is unacceptable. Yep. I'm just about to finish. Sorry, I've been hurried on. But I would like, so the final report, though, I think is really interesting, is it makes a range of recommendations, and I commend them to you. At the moment, we're waiting to see what the government says. But the first of these recommendations is that the Australian government develop a whole-of-government policy on communication by its agencies in languages other than English, including the use of interpreters and translators. The second is that the Australian government incorporate access and equity considerations and obligations into its whole-of-government communication and advertising guidelines, which currently don't exist. And finally, that the Australian government incorporate access and equity considerations and obligations into upgraded whole-of-government guidelines on the use of the internet as a communication and service delivery tool. These things are there on paper. We're waiting to see if the government actually accepts them, but I think more than anything, we need you to actually want them to take place. And I think in ending, and I do realise I've now gone over in terms of time, I wanted to talk about what needs to happen here, because we often talk about digital skills that allow people to communicate better and access information better. But I actually think the skills debate needs to be turned on its head and needs to be the skills of us as providers to do better, us as governments to do better. So what I believe that the skills, and I'll just run through those and finish on that. Right at the moment, what we need is a government, and I will concentrate on the government, but it actually applies to a range of other organisations, that needs to be far more aware of not only the headline numbers delivered by the ABS, but also the implication of those numbers. They need to understand how policies and programs that are provided for the whole population may need to be modified and adapted to meet individual groups' needs. They need to know a lot more about the factual tools of a multilingual society, such as the difference between written and spoken Chinese, the fact that Arabic spoken Arabic changes depending on country of origin. They need to understand the differences in core communities in level of English and first language literacy, as well as understanding that stating that you speak English well or very well on the census form does not mean that you have the English language literacy, or indeed that you can understand the letter, the pamphlet, the website information that has been prepared for consumers. They need to appreciate that second language is lost in the ageing process, and that this loss is accelerated with brain health conditions such as dementia, and that language skills are impaired in crisis or situation of stress. They need to know how diverse consumers access and consume all manner of information and their practical realities in how they negotiate the English-speaking world, and they need to know how to engage with core people and their communities so they can understand first-hand experience and hear first-hand voices. The glass is definitely not half full. We've got a long way to go, but it's still a wonderful country, and I thank you for this opportunity.